Welcome. This is our panel here at NLP Summit. The panel topic is NLP in practice. And so we're very delighted to have some folks here who are NLP practitioners. One of the things we wanted to do was to cover some of the questions and analysis that were brought up by the survey that was done by Gradient Flow, sponsored by John Snow Labs, about NLP in practice, and really drill down into that and hear in your terms, what you find in terms of deploying natural language applications in industry. So nothing particularly tied to the survey, but if we can bounce off it or embellish on that in any way, mostly to hear your experiences. Can we go around the room and, or rather around the Zoom, and do some intros? Amy, can you launch off, please?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Amy Heineke. I was on the founding team at Primate AI. So we build machines that read and write text. So a ton of different NLP problems that we've worked on over the years.
Wonderful. Felicia, could you please?
Sure. So hi, I'm Felicia. I'm a senior data scientist at Adarga, and mostly I work within the field of NLP for the purposes of knowledge discovery and knowledge organization, which is then used for further downstream analytical tasks.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Daniel, could you please?
Hi, I'm Daniel Vila. I'm the co-founder of Recognize, a small company from Spain, and we do a lot of NLP work for companies, especially in Europe. And we focus mostly on data extraction and classification for business process automation.
Wonderful. And Joel, could you please?
Yeah, hi, I'm Joel Gruss. I'm a principal engineer at Capital Group, where I lead a team that focuses on ML, NLP, search relevance, and things like that. Before I was at Capital Group, I was at the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, where I helped build the Allen NLP library, which is a deep learning library for NLP researchers. So,
wonderful. Thank you all very much for joining us. My name is Paco Nathan, and I'm at Darwin AI, and also been doing work in NLP for a long time. I tend to be more on the spacey side of the world and help lead a project called PyTextRank that some people use. Although also, I guess another big theme of the conference here is about Spark NLP, and for what it's worth, I did a lot of work with Spark back in the day. Okay, first question. I wanted to bounce off some of what we've found about industry results. Something was very stark. And the biggest takeaway was about budgets. So there seems to be a pretty strong indicator that budgets are up in 2020. Of course, it's a very difficult year, but we're still seeing reports as of even late summer that there's significant growth. Are you seeing that in the field in terms of working with customers, working with clients? Is there more commercial interest in production work in natural language?
If I can jump in, so we've definitely seen that, and we've had a phenomenal year on the sales side, which is quite surprising, as you said, given how difficult things are at the moment. So I think we're kind of, I think in some ways this kind of feels to me kind of that there's a couple of trends that are kind of going forward, right? We've seen incredible progress in what's possible with NLP, but we're also seeing that there's so much information out there, and with a global pandemic, you kind of realize even more so how things that affect you are affecting people all around the world. Like the scale of the information we're trying to understand goes up. So I think it kind of makes it more kind of crystal clear how important it is to have tools to help you kind of wade through stuff. But yeah, so we've definitely observed that.
Oh, fantastic. Other folks?
Yeah, I can maybe jump in as well. Yeah, we've definitely been seeing this in Europe, and one of the things we are seeing is that traditional consultancy and services companies, IT, they are offering like NLP projects, and we see many developers and data scientists getting into the field, which I think is a good thing. But also, as many pre-trained models are becoming available, we we also see some risk that people is not evaluating like baseline models before using transformers, for example. But yeah, definitely business interest is growing also in Europe.
Alicia, may I call on you? I really enjoyed an article that you had done recently. I believe it's GovGraph was the topic.
Right. Yes. So this was actually from my previous role. I worked in the UK government, specifically Government Digital Service, which, yeah, I was in a team that was, I guess, trying to optimize gov.uk, which is the UK government's central, I guess, starting point for most digital services. And I know from a government perspective, we certainly wanted to move and pivot towards becoming more data-driven. And I guess in terms of our budget, well, we have Treasury to handle our budget, but yeah, we were definitely supported, and our AWS bills kept ranking up. So yeah. But yeah, there's the definite interest to, I guess, take what already exists there and make it smarter, and for whatever definition of that word.
Very good. I want to come back to the point about cloud bills too, because that was another thing that came up. So we'll talk about that. Joel, what are you seeing? Because you've just made a transition from a very well-known research team into very much the commercial side.
Yeah, I mean, my perspective is a little bit different in that I'm really just working within a single big company. And so my experience is more that the demand is certainly strong, but sort of organizationally wide, you know, COVID has put the brakes on a lot of things. So the demand is not so strong that people are like, despite COVID, you know, we're going to pour our money into this one particular initiative.
Oh, very good. Where are the areas of demand? I mean, this is something else we were trying to poll for, but I guess to summarize the survey topics at aggregate, you know, we saw a lot of technology firms reporting, and then from there, finance and healthcare were pretty big, and the next tier down would have been like education. But are there specific cases that you're seeing grow, or specific areas of interest within an organization that are growing?
I mean, a lot of it that I see is where you have these sort of, you know, long-standing, very human-intensive processes where people are doing something manually or by hand, and it takes a long time and it's really tedious. And so opportunities where, you know, NLP can finally automate some of those things away and free up those people to do more interesting things. I see a lot of demand for work like that.
Very good.
Yeah, I think we see something similar. So people often want to kind of be able to classify and discover a piece of information that are going to be interesting to them and surface those ones to the top of the list. And then obviously, well, they come to us, especially when they're interested in summarization. So condense down across all the things that are interesting and get a takeaway.
Very interesting. You know, that was something that we tried to bring out in the analysis was the role that summarization is playing increasingly. And I don't think that it really came across as far as the questions. So, you know, it wasn't being reported as one of the top areas, but I believe that that tie-in from doing the classification and then going into some sort of summarization is where we are seeing a lot of interesting ways to augment what people do and help automate. And that seemed to be more of a signal coming from the practitioners as opposed to the general audience. Is it fair to say that summarization has gone through a major overhaul over the past couple of years?
It's such an interesting place to kind of play in, because I think there are a number of, there are different ways that you approach summarization, right? So that the heart of the problem is knowing what's important and what's interesting. And that's actually very use case dependent. It's very dependent on kind of what somebody wants to learn from it. So it's not kind of a neutral task that you do. It's quite a kind of a subtle one. I think the place that has been kind of staggering is the change in how well abstractive summarization works now. And especially with the kind of bigger new language models. So we have an internal, like our internal kind of research team, we actually launched a site this summer called so labs.primer.ai, where you can play around with some of the models we've been building. You can see kind of how that summarization is coming along. But the grammatical flow that is now possible with these models is just miles beyond what was possible a couple of years ago, and maybe what we could have imagined would have been possible. So that's kind of very transformational. I think it's still, as I said before, that, the first step is understanding what's important to people. And so a lot of these other kind of tasks of saying, okay, can I classify what information I see in a document? Can I extract what entities are in the document? Can I resolve those entities across documents or to knowledge bases or whatever? And start from a bit more of a structured understanding of, okay, these are the kinds of pieces of information that are important. And now I can figure out how I surface those so that all of the right information is condensed in front of somebody. They all come together at that end, in that end piece for a good summary.
So NLP is in essence, natural language is really focusing the lens. Would it be fair to say that a lot of applications really are approaching areas where just simply reading the text and creating a human-based summary would be overwhelmingly expensive or time-consuming? And so, is that a fair generalization of a lot of use cases that you're seeing?
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? Because we have so much more content online, or kind of that we can collect, and we should be aware of. When we've worked with analysts in the financial sector, for example, they're often kind of a little bit sheepish in kind of admitting how painful it is to read kind of 10K filings, for example, or documents that they know they really should have read, but there's just like a lot of paper there, and so I don't know. So part of it is kind of, there's probably always been kind of a bit of a problem there of like there's just kind of a lot of paper to work through, but it's so much easier to discover more of it, and more of these conversations are now online and indexed and discoverable, and so it becomes kind of clearer and clearer and clearer how tall that kind of stack of content really is.
And just to add a little bit to that, another use case above and beyond just like saving people time that they would have to spend like summarizing things, is that you can imagine if you have like a huge corpus of documents and you're trying to search through it or whatever, that being able to surface summaries at the same time you surface search results like gives people basically a new feature that they would not have even been able to have otherwise.
Interesting. Daniel, what kinds of areas are you seeing as far as customers in EU, enterprise customers in particular? Are there particular kinds of use cases that you're seeing emphasized?
So yeah, as Joel mentioned, we are seeing mostly internal uses of NLP for automating highly tedious manual work, such as for customer services order processing, for example, is a use case where you get a lot of emails to request products or spare materials. And this is people actually doing the job of reading the email and then taking the attachments and then inputting this information into SAP, for example. So we are seeing a lot of interest in this use case that help to automate part of the work. So as boring as it is, we are seeing that document classification, as you also pointed out in the survey, is actually a really, really in-point use case and an application of NLP. So I think many use cases we are seeing could be solved with basic data extraction plus document classification.
Interesting. It's fascinating. For what it's worth, I won't delve into ancient history, but in the mid-90s, I was involved in an early chatbot and e-commerce project. And I will shout out to my research colleague, Robbie Garner, and the other folks around Loebner Prize and whatnot. it's very strange to see how far chatbots have come, but I still have a lot of reservations just based on some history. But yet, on the other hand, a lot of what we're talking about here seems like people as chatbots. I mean, where the email is coming in to some enterprise organization and people are having to sit there and run through orders, it's almost as if, we're recognizing that a lot of jobs are effectively a chatbot kind of function. All righty, let me cut over. Yeah, okay, so one of the big contrasts I want to ask about is, I think that when you poll a lot of people who've been doing work in NLP and you ask about annotation tools, there's generally a very big thumbs up. This is a good practice. And when you poll people who aren't quite as experienced in working with natural language, the question is, well, what's an annotation tool? So I wanted to understand, I mean, does that resonate, or do you have any good stories along those lines?
Data collection and data cleaning and data processing and data tagging have been very big parts of my day-to-day job, I guess. I don't want to, I don't know if name dropping is allowed, but I guess Spacey's Prodigy probably is a big player. And especially like if you work in a domain-specific environment, like for example in government or in defense, especially when it's like local, because a lot of the big models have been trained, I guess, on sort of Americanized content. So you're not going to find many like UK, for example, specific references to departments or to agencies. So you pretty much need to get a group of subject matter experts together just to annotate everything and start building some sort of entity set. And I mean, in many cases, the entity, well, the standard named entity recognition labels like person, organization, location, and I don't know, miscellaneous are not sufficient, and you need to define also your own entity set, which could be quite of a struggle. And then that's, I guess, well, my point of interest would be automated ontology building, when you have to bring everything together and implement hierarchies and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's you definitely need your annotation, and you also, I guess, need a clear picture of the domain and how like stable it is, if it's dependent on time, and just take into account for all of these changes.
So I'm also a big fan of Prodigy. I use it quite a bit. And, to follow up on Paco's point, I've had a couple of junior people join my team, and they're very excited to get to do some, machine learning and training NLP models. And then, they found out exactly how much data they were going to have to label before they could train the model. And then it became a little bit less exciting, but they get it.
Yeah, and to jump in on this, I think it's easy to also kind of underestimate the complexity of what labeling is about. So one of the things that we've kind of found fascinating is when we'll talk to an organization and there's a document classification problem, saying they're like, we want to have corporate social responsibility documents discovered. And so of course you ask, well, what's that? What does that mean? And it turns out that this is an incredibly hard question. And so, what we're trying to do sometimes with NLP is take something that maybe an analyst used to read and think about a document and then kind of, make some value judgment about what it was about or how important it was. And we're trying to kind of automate that. And so like we're encoding some of their wisdom into a bunch of labels. But it turns out that everybody, has their own kind of mental model. And so the process of inter-annotator agreement turns out to be, the measures of that tend to be much, much worse than you could ever have imagined if you were going into this. So you ask two experts in the same company, is this document a good example of X, this thing that we're looking for? And typically we found for a lot of these classification problems, you'll start with inter-annotator agreement of 30%. So more often than not, they'll disagree with each other for something that they thought that they understood at the beginning. And so there's actually this enormous process around, I think I've heard this called kind of the policy sometimes, or the can you write down a document that describes in some kind of words when you would want to say true and when you'd want to say false, like to help somebody who is then doing a labeling? Can you agree on that kind of policy document? And often, developing that thing is very difficult, and by far the hardest part of the project, not the picking exactly which machine learning framework you're going to use, or something like that. So
measuring recall or something like that, you would think would be hard.
So there's kind of a whole world of expertise there, which maybe you don't necessarily quite expect when you've kind of learned the models initially.
Yeah, just really quick. There's someone on my team who is actually working on a text classification problem with some business users, and they're having this exact problem that the business knows in one sentence what it is they want to classify, but then when it comes down to, given an example, how would you classify this? They all disagree, and so we did this big experiment, and it turned out that, and I was one of the annotators in this experiment, and I was like a huge outlier. Like they actually reported one set of results for annotator agreement, like for everyone, and then one like excluding me. I was such an outlier. But then I went and looked at the ones where like I was the outlier, and I looked at the instructions, and I was right. Like, and so I'm gonna have to go in and like crack some skulls and be like, why did you guys annotate wrong? So.
And I just wanted to just give a couple of examples to make sure that this really makes sense to people. So one could be, like, so if you're labeling, which words in a document are people's names, like this should be a really simple task, right? We should all agree on that if you gave us all the document. So, but when you actually go and start doing this, you're like, well, do I include the Mrs. in front of the name or not? If someone's called out as a spokesperson or a president, are they a person, or is it only a person when it's a name? So often kind of the boundaries are kind of tricky. I heard an example from self-driving cars. So this is in images, one problem they have. So if I'm meant to label where a car is, if the car is actually hidden, but I know it's there somehow, is the car there if it's occluded or not? So you can imagine that there's all these kind of fascinating cases, and we all believe, like Joel, that we are right.
Well, I mean,
and strong belief.
Anecdotally, I'll throw in, I was on a project with a publisher, and they had a lot of documents to be classified for their search in front of the public, part of how they made money. And we went through this whole process of working with editors and getting a good means of classifying the different publications in their backlog. And then at the end of the day, the top executives pulled the plug because they wanted to reserve the right to make judgment calls. They didn't want to have any kind of an ontology because the executive editors wanted to be able to go in and say, well, I didn't like this person's book, so I'm just going to relabel it differently. So I see, is it fair to say that, as a general case in AI, we're seeing where there are problems at the exec level recognizing judgments that are partly automated, or recognizing how to really work in this world. And it seems like that's also where the rubber is hitting the road for NLP, is going into an organization and being able to agree on something like a controlled vocabulary.
Yeah, I can jump in. My background is in ontologies and knowledge management, and I see the same problem for annotation, is that you at least need to agree on, as you mentioned, the vocabulary and the entities you want to model in, and that's a really difficult task. And another thing I wanted to add is that people often see annotation as this beginning of the project, of an NLP project, but actually you need to do annotation through the whole lifetime of the models. So you need to take into account concept drift, you need to take into account, you need to monitor predictions in production, and you need to re-annotate. So this is something, it should be built into the NLP solution. It's true that Prodigy can help to start a project, and I think they are working on Prodigy teams or something like that, because you really need to do annotation management and to evolve the models, because it's not a one-shot thing.
Oh, that's interesting. So the annotation tools as a team effort, you need to have that kind of agreement or collaborative layer to be consistent. Yeah.
To add to that, I think one thing that's kind of cool about it, right, is that as we're kind of, so I find often, if you think about that kind of agreeing on the language or that kind of policy document, it's very hard to do that kind of just, just sit down with a piece of paper and write down, like, this is what we mean by X. Right. When you test it against the world, when you put it through that kind of NLP model and you come back with a bunch of the examples of like things that you probably didn't realize get classified one way or the other way, it's actually kind of a cool way to learn about language and to learn about what's in the data sets that are out there. And so I guess the kind of hope would be that the good part of that kind of difficult process you go through is that hopefully through it you clarify to yourself and to your team, you get some kind of agreement about what are these things that we're looking for. Where maybe when you didn't have to agree on a set of labels or an ontology, and you weren't monitoring that, you wouldn't realize that it was changing, or that you didn't actually, you didn't actually have a shared language yet. And so I think that's maybe at the kind of, you step back away from the technology a bit and you kind of think about that kind of learning from each other piece. It's kind of cool. it's kind of maybe a flip side.
Very interesting. So the process is sort of reflecting organizational knowledge, or what the organizational wisdom itself is the thing to bring to the surface. Mm-hmm. Well, one question also, something that we found, I wanted to understand if you're seeing this as well. The number 4 category was about knowledge graph or something related to this. And it seemed very natural what we're talking about, annotation and understanding vocabularies, and also probably ties in really well with the demand for named entity recognition or entity linking. In my work is largely intersecting natural language and knowledge graph, and I will definitely represent for the knowledge graph conference also. That we're talking with people and seeing this intersection. Are you seeing more work in knowledge graph individually?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one way of thinking about that is it's as we kind of build these models that let us structure information, you still then have to figure out how you want to explore and navigate that. And so different ways of rolling it up are really important. And so kind of that being able to kind of look at all the information you've got about an entity basically resolved to each other is a really powerful view, or seeing kind of the relationships between things kind of aggregated in interesting ways. That becomes richer and richer as the kind of building blocks get better. Becomes a really powerful additional piece of what you want to, what the tools that you need for exploration.
And I guess just to jump in, I guess just from what I've observed during my time in industry is that so far things have been mostly based on taxonomical perspective. People have been focusing, I guess, on classifying documents, figuring out how documents are related, or what you should read if you want to learn about a certain topic. But I guess nowadays they're trying to go a step deeper into that and just also figure out connections between topics and connections between concepts that are referenced in certain documents, and how everything relates to each other. Because yeah, I guess if you want to do intelligence, and if you want to do, I guess, smart understanding of content and that sort of thing, you probably want to understand the individual entities and artifacts that are referenced everywhere. So yeah, dynamically generating a knowledge graph from text is probably a good definition of what we're working on here in Adarga.
That's an interesting point. I mean, from like a UX perspective, where do people spend their time once they have that kind of discovery mechanism put in front of them? I've seen anecdotally where you might build a search engine, but it has a little sidebar to traverse the graph, and people end up spending more time traversing the graph because that's how they learn.
It's really useful for discovery, especially like when you don't exactly know what you want to find out. It's a good way to, it's like Wikipedia link hopping, I guess, just read through a domain.
Yeah, well, I mean, is it fair to say, I think that a lot of people associate the term knowledge graph with something, I still have nightmares of like circa 2005 and semantic web and going back in the day. But is knowledge graph no longer just a research topic? Is it something that companies are using?
I can jump in. Okay. What we see, at least in Europe, with the large companies, is that they're starting to know about knowledge graphs, but the main use cases that we see are related to metadata management, and also related to what they typically had in, for example, a relational database system. They are trying to move that into a knowledge graph, but we are seeing difficulties in making them understand the relation with NLP, for example. So they mostly see those use cases related to already structured data. But I think, as Amy mentioned, it's something that you need, if you are extracting data, you need to actually organize this into a relational form, and knowledge graphs are probably one of the most suitable forms to do that. We work on automation, as I mentioned. So basically, what they know they need some sort of linking between entities. For example, if you are extracting product names or product IDs, you need to relate those product IDs to other entities in the document. But they don't call that a knowledge graph. They just say, okay, we need the structure and we need to connect those entities. So basically, we don't build like an enterprise knowledge graph, but we do that in the data extraction process. We actually build a knowledge graph that will be probably stored as a separate thing, but not as an enterprise knowledge graph.
So is the graph work then informing the NLP work? I mean, for people who aren't as familiar with it, is it a two-way street? Does the natural language add to the graph, and does the graph add to the natural language work?
Sorry, again?
Well, I wanted to clarify something you said there was really interesting. It seems that in a lot of these cases, the work with graphs is providing context and building up context iteratively that would not necessarily be available on the surface if you're just going in and scanning a bunch of documents. So is it a two-way street where, as you're working with the documents and annotating them and building up that kind of structure, is the structure going back and informing the natural language process or improving the context and accuracy of the natural language process?
I see, things like distance supervision and things like that. I see a lot of promise, but actually we are not using them for industrial projects at the moment, because basically sometimes it's really difficult to get this graph, this background knowledge for doing the NLP work. So basically we start from scratch or from a taxonomical list and things like that. So basically, but yeah, this definitely informs the NLP data extraction process. But we don't get like a real knowledge graph to start with.
Triples and being able to do inference across. Okay, great. I do believe that we're coming up on time. Any last words? We can go around the Zoom. Not last words, but closing thoughts. Joel, you look like you were going to say something there.
Yeah, so I'm actually in an organization where my team and a lot of the NLP practice is somewhat like young, and so I focus a lot on either solving low-hanging fruit kind of problems and really like demonstrating value to the business, and so I'm really more at that stage. A lot of the things like knowledge graphs are kind of like dreams down the road that once I build up enough credibility, like I have a grand vision for that. But I guess my point is I think there's, in a lot of organizations, there's still a lot of value in looking for that low-hanging fruit, and solving relatively simple NLP problems can help.
Felicia.
I guess on that, the most important thing is to know your data and know your problem, because you don't necessarily need to deploy BERT to tag everything. You don't need to set up a knowledge graph for everything. But I guess we're getting closer to something like knowledge graph as a product or as a platform and things like that, it would be really interesting to see how UX and how UIs evolve with this sort of I know machine-generated insights pipeline that we're moving towards. Because yeah, I don't think that we've been thinking enough about how people are actually meant to interact with this sort of information, if it's meant to be actionable. Because it's all well and good if you just need to tag certain documents with a topic, but you actually need to show this sort of thing to a person and have them come to a decision. It's not enough to just dump a list of documents and say this is what the machine says. So it'd be interesting to figure out how we interact with this sort of system in the future.
Very, very well said. That roadmap is the big picture. Amy, I'll call on you.
Yeah, so I think one thing I wanted to call out is kind of to building teams, and this is something, Paco, we've talked about before, huh? So building teams that can execute on this stuff. I think it's really important to hire people, if you're in this position, hire people with kind of a range of skill sets. So I think some of what we touched on is that there's quite a lot of different problems that you end up having to solve if you want to actually build products that sit on top of text data with kind of a dose of NLP. So there's a part of that that's kind of, understanding BERT or some of these kind of interesting deep models. There's some of it that is very UX. There's some of it that's very much about understanding clients and users and people and how they talk and language. Well, we've had some journalists on our team, and that's been really interesting, the kind of perspective they bring on like how people write and how you think about that. And then also on the kind of ML ops or the kind of infrastructure engineering side for how you're going to deploy these models and maintain them over time. And I think you only really pull this off if you do have a pretty broad mix of skills. And you've got kind of a good collaboration between those people. And I think that's one of the things that makes this kind of a fun place to play as well, and that getting to work across these very different kind of aspects of the problem to try and pull something off together.
Very good. Very good. Daniel, any closing remarks? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So it's the closing remark or what? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, one thing that I missed in the conversation is something you mentioned in the survey, some of the results regarding readiness of like business drivers and cost effectiveness. I think that's key for seeing adoption of NLP within companies. Is that for example, in Europe, we don't see many companies. We see interest in NLP, but for example, large banks or manufacturing companies, some of them they don't want to invest in having GPUs for inference, for example. So I think like trying to solve simple problems, as Joel mentioned, I think is a key point to start adopting NLP. So some things like, as we mentioned, document classification and data structure, for example. And I think that's a thing related also to pre-trained models, that some of them are not cost effective for many use cases, especially if you are trying to automate a business process that is costly. You cannot put a model that is really costly as well to solve that problem. So that would be my last comment.
Well said.
Okay, Paco, I want to plug my talk, although I think by the time this airs, my talk will have already been shown. But my talk is really about how to build like the simplest possible proof of concept of an NLP problem. So it's related to these points. Wonderful. And it already aired probably.
Well, I recommend everyone here who'll be speaking at the conference and also in related work. I want to thank you all. Excellent insights here talking about more of the pragmatics and what this is really like in industry. So Amy, Felicia, Joel, Daniel, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll wish you all well.
Thanks.
Thank you.